Almost everyone will agree that we live in a deeply troubled society. One of the most widespread manifestations of the craziness of our world is leftism. So discussion of the psychology of leftism can serve as an introduction to the discussion of the problems of modern society in general.
When we speak of leftists, we have in mind mainly socialists, collectivists, politically correct types, feminists, gay and disability activists, animal rights activists, and the like. Even so, our conception of leftism will remain a good deal less clear than we would wish.
But there doesn't seem to be any remedy for this. All we are trying to do here is indicate, in a rough and approximate way, the two psychological tendencies that we believe are the main driving force of modern leftism.
The two psychological tendencies that underlie modern leftism we call feelings of inferiority and over-socialization. Feelings of inferiority are characteristic of modern leftism as a whole, while over-socialization is characteristic only of a certain segment of modern leftism.
But that segment is highly influential. By feelings of inferiority, we mean not only inferiority feelings in the strict sense, but a whole spectrum of related traits.
Low self-esteem, feelings of powerlessness, depressive tendencies, defeatism, guilt, self-hatred, etc.
We argue that modern leftists tend to have such feelings,
Possibly more or less repressed.
These feelings are decisive in determining the direction of modern leftism.
When someone interprets as derogatory almost anything that is said about him or about groups with whom he identifies, we conclude that he has inferiority feelings.
Or low self-esteem.
This tendency is pronounced among minority rights activists.
Whether or not they belong to the minority groups whose rights they defend, they are hypersensitive about the words used to designate minorities and about anything that is said concerning minorities. Negro, Oriental, handicapped, or
Chick.
For an African, an Asian, a disabled person,
Or a woman.
originally had no derogatory connotation.
Broad and chick were merely the feminine equivalents of guy, dude, or fellow.
The negative connotations have been attached to these terms by the activists themselves.
Some animal rights activists have gone so far as to reject the word pet and insist on its replacement by animal companion.
Leftish anthropologists go to great lengths to avoid saying anything about primitive peoples that could conceivably be interpreted as negative.
They want to replace the word primitive by non-literate.
They seem almost paranoid about anything that might suggest that any primitive culture is inferior to our
Those who are most sensitive about politically incorrect terminology
are not the average black ghetto dweller,
Asian immigrant,
Abused woman or
disabled person, but a minority of activists.
many of whom do not even belong to any oppressed group.
but come from privileged strata of society.
Political correctness has its stronghold amongst university professors, who have secure employment with comfortable salaries.
and the majority of whom are heterosexual white males from middle to upper class families.
Many leftists have an intense identification with the problems of groups that have an image of being weak,
Women,
defeated,
American Indians.
repellent,
Homosexuals,
or otherwise inferior.
The leftists themselves feel that these groups are inferior.
they would never admit to themselves that they have such feelings.
But it is precisely because they do see these groups as inferior that they identify with their problems.
feminists are desperately anxious to prove that women are as strong and as capable as men. Clearly, they are nagged by a fear that women may not be as strong and as capable as men.
Leftists tend to hate anything that has an image of being strong, good, and successful.
They hate America.
They hate Western civilization.
They hate white males.
They hate rationality.
The reason that leftists give for hating the West clearly do not correspond with their real motives.
They say they hate the West because it is warlike, imperialistic,
Sexist.
Ethnocentric, and so forth.
But where these same faults appear in socialist countries, the leftist finds excuses for them.
or at best he grudgingly admits that they exist.
Whereas he enthusiastically points out and often greatly exaggerates these faults where they appear in Western civilization.
It is clear that these faults are not the leftist' real motive for hating America and the West.
He hates America and the West because they are strong and successful.
Words like self-confidence, self-reliance, initiative, enterprise, optimism
Play little role in the liberal and leftist vocabulary.
The leftist is anti-individualistic,
Pro-collectivist.
He wants society to solve everyone's problems for them.
satisfy everyone's needs for them.
Take care of them.
He's not the sort of person who has an inner sense of confidence in his ability to solve his own problems.
Or satisfy his own needs.
The leftist is antagonistic to the concept of competition because
Deep inside,
He feels like a loser.
art forms that appeal to modern leftish intellectuals tend to focus on sordidness, defeat, and despair.
or else they take an orgiastic tone, throwing off rational control as if there were no hope of accomplishing anything through rational calculation, and all that was left was to immerse oneself in the sensations of the moment.
Modern leftish philosophers tend to dismiss reason, science, objective reality, and to insist that everything is culturally relative.
It is true that one can ask serious questions about the foundations of scientific knowledge and about how, if at all, the concept of objective reality can be defined.
It is obvious that modern leftish philosophers are not simply cool-headed logicians, systematically analyzing the foundations of knowledge.
They are deeply involved emotionally in their attack on truth and reality.
They attack these concepts because of their own psychological needs.
For one thing, their attack is an outlet for hostility.
And to the extent that it is successful,
It satisfies the drive for power.
more importantly, the leftist hates science and rationality because they classify certain beliefs as true, i.e.,
i.e., successful.
Superior.
And other beliefs as false.
i.e., failed.
Inferior.
The leftist's feelings of inferiority run so deep that he cannot tolerate any classification of some things as successful or superior.
And other things as failed or inferior.
This also underlies the rejection by many leftists of the concept of mental illness and the utility of IQ tests.
Leftists are antagonistic to genetic explanation of human abilities.
Or behavior.
Because such explanations tend to make some persons appear superior or inferior to others.
Leftists prefer to give society the credit or blame for an individual's ability or lack of it.
If a person is inferior, it's not his fault, but society's, because he has not been brought up properly.
The leftist's feelings of inferiority are so ingrained that he cannot conceive of himself as individually strong and valuable.
Hence, the collectivism of the leftist. He can feel strong only as a member of a large organization or a mass movement with which he identifies himself.
Notice the masochistic tendency of leftist tactics. Leftists protest by laying down in front of vehicles.
They intentionally provoke police or racists to abuse them.
These tactics may often be effective.
But many leftists use them not as a means to an end, but because they prefer masochistic tactics.
Self-hatred is a leftist trait. Leftists may claim that their activism is motivated by compassion or by moral principles.
Compassion and moral principle cannot be the main motives for leftist activism.
Hostility is too prominent a component of leftist behavior.
So is the drive for power.
Moreover, much leftist behavior is not rationally calculated to be of benefit to the people whom leftists claim to be trying to help.
If one believes that affirmative action is good for black people, does it make sense to demand affirmative action in hostile or dogmatic terms?
Obviously, it would be more productive to take a diplomatic and conciliatory approach.
That would make at least verbal and symbolic concessions to white people who think that affirmative action discriminates against them.
But leftists do not take such an approach because it would not satisfy their emotional needs.
Helping black people is not their real goal. Instead, race problems serve as an excuse for them to express their own hostility and frustrated need for power.
In doing so, they actually harm black people, because the activist hostile attitude towards the white majority tends to intensify race hatred.
If our society had no social problems at all, the leftists would have to invent problems in order to provide themselves with an excuse for making a fuss.